see some very interesting things that I believe took place after the flood. Job refers to an ice age. Well, the people who are well versed in evolution and things like that tell us that the earth did in fact have an ice age at one point. And I believe that right after the flood, the earth was still in a transitional phase, going from the time before the flood, when you had water seeping up out of the ground and there was no rain and there was a mist and you had sort of a temperate climate all the way around the earth, to probably something that changed. Maybe the earth shifted at that time or whatever. And then after the flood, you still have a transition phase and an ice age. And I think Job talks about that. And so the oldest book of the Bible that we're aware of is the book of Job. And here is Job, God himself. Now this is not Job's description. God himself speaking to Job is describing this creature that he refers to as Behemoth. Look at what it says. Job 40 verse 15. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. Stop right here. The Bible's telling you just what we said. All the animals on the earth were made on day 6 of creation. And so here God is saying to Job, this is Behemoth, and I made him the same day that I made mankind. God didn't make them 65 million years ago. He made them on the same day during the creation week. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox. Lo now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. Stop right here. And we talked about this in the dinosaur video. He moveth his tail like a cedar. Now, some of the notes of some of these Bibles will tell you, well, that was a hippopotamus, or that was an elephant, because an elephant's big and a hippopotamus is big. But it says that he moveth his tail like a cedar. You ever seen the tail of a hippopotamus? It's a little bitty thing sticks out. I mean, here you have this great big, hippopotamus thing. And it's got a little bitty tail like that. Or an elephant's tail. It's a little bit longer, just kind of hangs down there. Doesn't look like a cedar. Cedars in the Middle Eastern nations, Middle Eastern area, these were huge things. And God was pointing out to Job, this behemoth creature moves his tail like a cedar. He is huge. If you think about Brontosaurus or Brachiosaurus or any of these other large-bodied, four-legged, land-based animals, they were huge. We have their bones left over. These things were large. And God said, remember this creature. I made him on the same day as you. Look what else he says. He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. Look what he said in verse 23. Behold, he drinketh up a river and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. He taketh it with his eyes. His nose pierceth through the snares. God is describing, number one, the fact that he can consume large amounts of water in a single setting. And he's not in any hurry to do it, but he will take in large amounts of water into his body. His nose pierceth through snares. In other words, they couldn't trap him. They would try to trap this behemoth, and his nose would just pierce right through the snares, and you couldn't do anything with it. I believe that God was describing for Job what Job, and he said, behold now Behemoth. God was not telling him some myth. Have you ever heard the story, from your dad about Behemoth? Well, let me tell you what I think about. He said, no, behold him. In other words, set your eyes on him, Job. You've seen him. You know what I'm talking about. Job's just sitting there nodding his head, thinking of what God's telling him. God is not a man that he should tell a myth. God is not a man that he should lie. So God was describing these creatures. Behemoth, I believe, is a Brontosaurus, Brachiosaurus, or any number of those large-bodied, long-tailed, long-necked, four-footed creatures that dwelt on the earth at the time before the flood and right after the flood. These people saw them. Then we get into the next chapter of the book of Job, Job chapter 41. And God says this, canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Now God is going to describe, a behemoth lives on the land, and God's describing that to Job. And now he's going to describe another creature, a mystery monster from the Bible. He's going to describe what's called a Leviathan. And remember, this is God speaking. And God told Job, I made Behemoth on the same day I made man. And God tells Job here in Job 41, he said, I made him, and I can unmake him. I can do whatever I want to. I'm not afraid of him. But apparently, Leviathan was such a ferocious beast that lived in the sea that no man wanted to have anything to do with him. If anybody saw Leviathan in the ocean, in the sea, they stayed away from it. Look at God's description of Leviathan. Job 41, verse 14. Who can open the doors of his face? His teeth are terrible round about. His scales are his pride. He has scales, shut up as with a close seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together. They cannot be sundered. By his neesings a light doth shine, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. In other words, he has glowing eyes. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. In his neck remaineth strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. The flakes of his flesh are joined together. They are firm in themselves. They cannot be moved. His heart is as firm as a stone, yea, as hard as a piece of nether millstone. Now, this to me is fascinating, because God has not only given you a physical description of Leviathan, he's also, and here's where I want you to start understanding the nature of these mystery creatures and why I think they're so important. Because now God is not just describing his physical characteristics. He has scales. He has a very large body. His flames come out of his mouth. Now, is that so difficult for us to believe? Because after all, we see lightning bugs and we can dissect them and kind of find out what it is. There's a fire beetle that actually makes fire. Electric eels electrocute people. How did they get that? Because God created them that way. And so now we have, and by the way, all these descriptions of dragons in every culture and every civilization in the world, they all breathe fire. Every one of them. And so God is describing what I believe is a sea monster, a seafaring dragon called Leviathan. The Bible says that when he was going, in Job chapter 41, the Bible says when he goes underwater, it looks like he sends bubbles up out of his nose, probably from whatever he's doing in there with the heat, the flames, and everything like that. The Bible says it looks like a hoarfrost. You can actually trail him through the water. So that I believe what this says, because all of these civilizations all over the world drew pictures of them. They knew exactly what this creature was. But then he says, in verse 24, he said, his heart is as firm as a stone, yea, his heart is a piece of the nether millstone. That's not just describing his appearance. It's describing his nature. Someone, we refer to someone who has a hard heart as someone that they won't listen to reason. They won't listen to you. You cannot convince them of anything. And isn't that the nature of some animals, some creatures, some beasts? Is that you can't reason with them. You can't argue with them. You cannot steer them away. Once they've set their eyes on you, you cannot do anything to deter them. And that's what that is referring to. Very, very important piece of information. Because you and I have to deal with Leviathan. I will teach you that next week. But we're going to study some more of these mystery creatures. Here is, watch this now. Here is what scientists refer to as these sea dragons or these sea creatures. You've heard of a plesiosaur. There are other species of this, of giant dinosaur animals that lived in lakes, they lived in rivers, they lived in seas. And the Bible describes them as Leviathan. And are they mythological? Did they exist? Well, according to the paleontologists, they did exist. Only they would say, no, it was 65 million years ago, and there's no way that man interacted with these. Well, we have descriptions all over the world of, in ancient times, man interacting with sea monsters, with creatures exactly like this. Several years ago, back in the 70s, a Japanese, I showed you this picture in the dinosaur video, a Japanese fishing boat pulled up something out of the ocean, rotting carcass of, take a look at it. I mean, you be the judge. This is an actual photograph of what looks like a very, very large plesiosaur creature that apparently had been alive recently. And if you don't, now they say, well, that was just a big shark, and you know, here's our evidence, and so on. So if you don't believe that one, take a look at this. This is another picture. This is a drawing made by the Aborigines of Australia. Apparently, they hunted and killed a giant plesiosaur. Notice the size of this creature in relation to the size of the people dancing around it. You see adults and you see children. The adults have spears. Notice the plesiosaur. Notice the teeth that he has, the ferociousness. Notice what looks like, I don't know if this is if it's describing the outside appearance of it, or what could possibly be the digestive tract of this animal, having three stomachs like a cow. Notice the spinal column. This is a real creature. Here is an Egyptian seal made I don't know how many thousand years ago with what looks like a plesiosaur on it. We have ancient descriptions. Look at this mosaic of ships interacting and doing battle with one of these monsters, one of these creatures that God describes as Leviathan in Job chapter 41. Here is a vase with one of those. You see dolphins in the background, so obviously this is not a dolphin. This is what they would say is a plesiosaur, what God refers to as a Leviathan. And again, men doing battle with it. Now, this is interesting, because if you go and read Job chapter 41, you see that God's saying that anybody that has ever done battle with one of these things, if they had a chance to do it again, they wouldn't. Apparently, these things put up a ferocious fight. And once you've dealt with one, if you live through it, you would probably not ever want to go back and do that again. I want to ask you a question, just kind of something for you to think about between now and next week. Have you ever had one of those battles in your life where you battled something very, very bad and evil? Maybe an inner battle. And you got through that, but you hope that you'd never have to go through that again. There's a reason why God is telling us about these very, very scary, mysterious creatures in the Bible. I'll show you that next week. Ancient mariners, seafaring men from all throughout history have all encountered these giant sea creatures, and the Bible just is telling you that they are real. Here's an old painting on a wall. You can see the intertwining necks of these two. What they look like is plesiosaurs, what the Bible refers to as leviathans. Now, these creatures were real. Here is the skeletal remains